Winter in North Dakota has a certain silence to it, the kind that presses in on you, making every footstep sound deafening in the stillness. That night, I was walking alone, heading back to my relative's house from a friend's place. It was late, well past 3 a.m., and the snow-covered road stretched in front of me, untouched except for my own footprints trailing behind. The town was small, the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, and the streets were empty after dark. The cold had driven everyone inside, and even the distant hum of traffic was absent. The only sound was the soft crunch of my boots sinking into the freshly fallen snow. The air was bitter, each breath stinging my throat as I exhaled clouds of white. I stuffed my hands deeper into my coat pockets and kept walking, my pace steady but unhurried. It was only a 15-minute walk to my uncle's house, and I had done it plenty of times before. But that night, something felt off. I couldn't explain it at first. Maybe it was just the way the trees stood so still in the windless air, or how the streetlights flickered in and out as I passed beneath them. Maybe it was the way my breath sounded too loud, like I wasn't alone in the silence. I kept walking. I wasn't the type to spook easily. Then I saw him. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the dim streetlights against the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He stood just off the road, partially hidden behind the tree line, barely more than a silhouette against the snow. Something about him made my stomach clench. He was completely still, facing me, his head tilted slightly. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see the dark outline of a ski mask covering his face. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold crept down my spine. I slowed my pace, every instinct telling me to turn around. But turning my back on him felt worse. So I kept walking, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. I didn't want to make it obvious that I'd seen him, but my entire body was screaming at me to get away. I forced myself to breathe evenly, counting my steps in my head. 1, 2, 3. Then he moved. It was just a small movement, a shift of his weight, the barest tilt of his head. But I saw it. He wasn't just standing there. He was watching me. My mind raced. Maybe he was just some guy out for a smoke. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew better. I kept my pace steady, refusing to break into a run. If I ran, it would feel like admitting I was scared, like inviting him to chase me. I passed the spot where he stood, my peripheral vision catching the slightest turn of his head as I walked by. I didn't look directly at him. I didn't want him to know that I knew. Then, just as I was about to turn the corner onto my uncle's street, I heard it. Crunch. The sound of a footstep in the snow. Panic surged through me. I picked up my pace, my hands clenched into fists in my coat pockets. The house wasn't far, just a few more blocks. Another step. Crunch. He was following me. I forced myself not to run. If I ran, I'd make noise. If I ran, I'd slip on the ice. If I ran, I wouldn't hear him coming. Instead, I kept walking, faster now, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I could hear his footsteps behind me, matching my speed. I reached the turn to my uncle's street and risked a glance over my shoulder. He was closer. I could see the house now. The porch light was on, casting a dim glow onto the snow-covered yard. I just had to make it a little farther. But then, the footsteps stopped. I didn't stop. I didn't dare. I kept walking, my heart hammering in my chest. Had he turned around? Was he still there? I was almost at the driveway when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper. Low. Almost playful. Why are you in such a hurry? I ran. My boots skidded on the ice as I sprinted up the driveway, my hands fumbling for my keys. My breath came in ragged gasps, my fingers numb and shaking. I reached the door and jammed the key into the lock, twisting desperately. Nothing. The lock wouldn't turn. My hands were too cold, too unsteady. I could feel him behind me. I didn't dare turn around. My breath hitched as I forced my hand to steady. The key slid, the lock clicked, and I yanked the door open, practically throwing myself inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my entire body shaking. I pressed my forehead against the cold wood, my ears straining for any sound outside. Silence. I forced myself to breathe, to listen. Nothing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The street was empty. The man in the ski mask was gone. I barely slept that night. Every sound, every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I stayed up, staring at the window, half expecting to see that ski-masked face staring back at me from the darkness. The next morning, I checked the snow outside. There were footprints. They led up the driveway. But there were no prints leading away. Whoever he was, he had stood there, watching, waiting, and then, somehow, he had disappeared. I never walked alone at night again. I've always been drawn to the solitude of the woods. There's something about being deep in nature, away from the hum of city life, that clears my mind. I also enjoy geocaching, a modern-day treasure hunt using GPS coordinates to find hidden containers or caches placed by other enthusiasts. Some are as simple as a small capsule tucked behind a road sign, but the ones I love the most are the ones deep in the wilderness, requiring real effort to find. So when I stumbled upon a forum post describing an unlisted geocache far from any marked trail, I was intrigued. The poster was vague about its origins, just a set of coordinates and a cryptic message. For those who seek, the forest gives. But not all treasures are meant to be found. That only made me more determined. I spent the next few days preparing. The cache was supposedly deep in the forest, far from the usual geocaching hotspots. I checked the coordinates on my map, about 6 miles from the nearest road, along a stream that wound through dense woodland. It wasn't an official cache, meaning it wasn't registered on geocaching sites, which made it all the more intriguing. I packed the essentials: a GPS device, extra batteries, a flashlight, a multi-tool, food, and water. My backpack felt a little heavier than usual, but I was prepared for a long hike. The day was overcast when I set out, the sky covered in a thick layer of gray clouds that diffused the sunlight, making the forest seem dim even in the afternoon. The air was cool, and a faint breeze rustled the branches above. For the first few miles, the hike was uneventful. I followed an old, overgrown trail along the stream, stepping over fallen branches and brushing past thick undergrowth. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I hadn't seen a single bird or heard the usual hum of insects. I chalked it up to the weather. As I neared the coordinates, the terrain became rougher. The trees grew denser, their twisted roots creating a web over the ground. The underbrush thickened, and I had to push through brambles that tugged at my clothes and scratched my arms. My GPS told me I was only 100 yards away from the cache. Then I saw it. Tucked beneath a cluster of moss-covered rocks was a metal ammo box, partially hidden under decaying leaves. My heart pounded with excitement. I crouched and brushed away the debris, feeling a rush of satisfaction. This was why I loved geocaching: the thrill of discovery, the reward for persistence. I pulled the box free and examined it. The metal was rusted in places, but the lid was intact. It was heavier than I expected. Most geocaches contained small trinkets or logbooks, but this felt different. I unclasped the lid and lifted it open. Inside was a pile of broken doll parts. I froze. At first, my brain struggled to process what I was looking at. The limbs were plastic, arms and legs detached from their bodies, some with jagged, snapped-off edges. The heads were the worst. Some had missing eyes, others had cracked faces, their painted features frozen in eerie, distorted expressions. The plastic had yellowed with age, and dust clung to the crevices. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. People left all kinds of things in geocaches, some as jokes, some to creep out whoever found them. Maybe it was just someone's idea of a prank. Then, I noticed the piece of paper resting on top of the pile. It was old, the edges brittle and stained. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The writing was uneven, almost frantic. "Look behind you." My breath caught in my throat. The words sent a jolt of ice through my veins. My fingers tightened around the paper as every hair on my body stood on end. I didn't want to look. I really didn't want to. But I had to. Slowly, stiffly, I turned my head. The forest was still. The trees loomed around me, their trunks dark and unmoving. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for something, anything, that didn't belong. Nothing. Just the endless, silent woods. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to breathe. Maybe it was just part of the prank, a psychological trick. Someone had planted this box here to freak people out. And it had worked. I shook my head, trying to laugh at myself. I was letting my imagination get the best of me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I closed the ammo box and shoved it back under the rocks, covering it hastily with leaves. My heart was still hammering, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to run. Running in the woods was dangerous. One wrong step, and I could twist an ankle or worse. I started walking, retracing my steps, but I couldn't shake the tension in my body. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I'd see something, or someone following me. The forest felt different now. The air was thicker, the silence heavier. My footsteps seemed too loud, like they didn't belong in the stillness. I picked up my pace, pushing through the underbrush, ignoring the scratches on my arms. Then I heard it, a rustling sound behind me. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, something moving through the brush. I turned sharply, my pulse roaring in my ears. The trees stood silent, their twisted branches reaching toward the gray sky. I scanned the undergrowth, my eyes darting between the trunks. Nothing. And then, a soft crunch, closer this time. I didn't wait. I bolted. My legs burned as I sprinted through the woods, branches whipping against my arms. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. The path ahead blurred as panic took over. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs screaming for air. But I didn't stop. The trail opened up ahead. I could see the break in the trees where I had entered the forest. My car was parked just beyond that. Almost there. A sudden snap to my right, like a branch breaking underfoot. I didn't look. I didn't want to see what was there. I broke through the tree line, my boots skidding on the gravel as I reached my car. My hands fumbled for the keys. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. For a long moment, I just sat there, my chest heaving, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I forced myself to look back at the woods. The trees stood tall and silent. Nothing moved. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I never went geocaching alone again. Camping alone in the wilderness is something I've done dozens of times. I know how to prepare, how to stay safe, how to keep my wits about me. I've always found a certain peace in it, just me, my gear, and the open land stretching out in all directions. But after this trip, I don't think I'll ever do it again. It started as a normal weekend. I'd planned a 3-night solo trip deep into a national forest. Not a designated campground, just a remote spot off trail, far from roads or other campers. The kind of place where you can sit by your fire and know, with absolute certainty, that you are completely alone. Or at least you should be. I parked at a small, unmarked pull-off near the forest boundary, shouldered my pack, and started hiking in. The first few miles were easy, wide, well-worn trails used by hunters and backpackers. But after a couple of hours, I veered off the main path and started cutting through the dense undergrowth, navigating with my map and compass. This was how I liked it. Untouched wilderness, no signs of people, just the sound of my boots crunching against the forest floor. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I'd scouted on my map, a clearing near a small stream, shielded by thick pines on 3 sides. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, with just enough space for my tent and a fire pit. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and got to work. First, I set up my tent, a simple one-person shelter, just enough room for me and my gear. Then, I gathered firewood, making sure to stack enough for the night. By the time I had a good fire going, the sun was dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. I ate a quick meal, dehydrated beef stew, warmed over the fire, then leaned back against a log, staring up at the sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, and the only sounds were the crackling flames and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I felt completely at peace. Until I saw him. It was just a flicker of movement at first, a slight shift in the darkness beyond the fire's glow. My brain barely registered it. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the underbrush. But then I saw it again. A shape. A person. Standing just inside the tree line, barely visible between the trunks. My stomach clenched. I sat up slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The firelight didn't reach far into the woods, but there was enough of a glow to make out a vague silhouette. Tall. Motionless. Watching. I forced myself to think rationally. Maybe it was a hiker who had gotten lost. A hunter, checking his surroundings. But deep down, I knew neither of those things made sense. I was miles off trail, far from any logical destination. No one should have been out here, especially not just standing silently in the dark. "Hello." I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I felt my stomach tighten. If it were a normal person, they would have said something, called back, stepped forward, acted human. But this person just stood there, watching. I kept my eyes locked on the figure as I slowly reached for my knife. It wasn't much, a fixed-blade camping knife, about 6 inches long, but it was better than nothing. Still, no movement. No sound. Just a presence, standing at the edge of the trees. A cold dread crept up my spine. Finally, after what felt like forever, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear branches snapping or leaves rustling. He was just gone. I sat there, knife clenched in my hand, heart pounding. I told myself it was fine. Maybe it was just someone passing through, someone who saw my fire and got curious. But deep down, I didn't believe that, because something was off. Everything in me screamed that whoever that was, they weren't just passing through. I debated packing up and hiking out, but it was nearly full dark now, and trying to navigate through dense forest at night was a terrible idea. My best bet was to stay alert, keep my fire going, and wait for morning. I added more wood to the flames, the glow pushing back the darkness just a little further. The rest of the night passed in slow, tense silence. I didn't hear anything unusual. No more movement. No footsteps. But that didn't mean I slept. I sat up for hours, knife in my lap, staring out at the trees. Every time I let my eyes close, I saw that shape standing there again, watching, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I drifted into an uneasy sleep, waking up at every small sound. And in the morning, I found the footprints. The dirt near my fire was soft, covered in fallen pine needles. When I stepped out of my tent, the first thing I saw was a set of footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the tree-line to the edge of my camp, circling my fire, passing near my tent. Then they went back into the woods. A sick feeling settled in my gut. Someone had been in my camp while I slept. Someone had walked right up to my tent, just feet away from where I lay, completely unaware. I scanned the tree line, my body tense, every hair on my neck standing up. Nothing. But that didn't mean whoever had been there was gone. I moved quickly. I kicked dirt over the fire, broke down my tent, shoved everything into my pack with shaking hands. My heart was pounding, so hard it made me feel sick. I wasn't taking any chances. Whoever had been watching me, whoever had walked through my camp in the middle of the night, they had bad intentions. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started hiking out. Fast. Every few steps, I glanced back. I imagined that figure stepping out from behind a tree, following me. I imagined hearing footsteps that weren't mine. But the woods were silent. It took me half the time to get back to my car than it had to hike in. I practically threw my gear in the back seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. Only when I was miles away did I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I don't know who that was. I don't know why they were out there, why they stood there watching, why they walked through my camp while I slept. But I do know one thing. I'm never camping alone again. That trip changed everything for me. I used to love solo camping, the solitude, the feeling of being truly alone in the wilderness. Now I can't shake the feeling that I'm never really alone. Somewhere out there, past the firelight, past the trees, someone could be watching. Camping alone had always been my thing. Something about the solitude of the woods, the quiet hum of nature, the distant hoot of an owl. It all felt like an escape from the constant noise of daily life. That weekend, I had picked a spot deep within a national forest, far away from any marked campsites. I had hiked about 7 miles off trail to find the perfect clearing, nestled between towering pines with a small creek running nearby. The hike had been exhausting, but the moment I set up camp, it felt worth it. By the time I had my tent pitched and a small fire going, the sun had already started dipping below the treetops. I sat by the flames, eating a simple dinner of instant noodles and jerky, listening to the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. No distant voices, no hum of traffic, just me, the wilderness, and the darkening sky above. When the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, zipping myself into my sleeping bag. It was a chilly night, but I had layered up. I let out a deep sigh, feeling my muscles relax for the first time all day. My flashlight rested beside me, and my knife was within reach, as always. The stillness was comforting, until it wasn't. Somewhere between waking and dreaming, I heard it. A breath. Not mine. Deep. Slow. Deliberate. I froze. My body tensed so hard that my muscles ached. I didn't move. I barely dared to breathe. The sound came again, just outside my tent. A long inhale, then an equally slow exhale. The breaths weren't hurried, weren't ragged. They were steady, calm. Someone was standing right next to my tent, breathing in the cold night air. My heart pounded so hard in my chest I swore whoever was outside could hear it. I slowly reached for my flashlight, careful not to make a sound. The breathing continued. Low, unbothered. Close. I strained to listen for footsteps, rustling. Anything that would tell me if whoever it was had just arrived, or if they had been standing there for minutes, watching me. But there was nothing. Just breath after breath. I gripped my flashlight, my fingers trembling. Should I turn it on? Should I announce myself? Would that make things worse? Then, the sound changed. A slow drag of fingers across the fabric of my tent. Not a casual brush. Not the wind. Someone dragging their hand over the nylon, deliberately. A chill ran down my spine, locking me in place. My mind raced. Think. Stay calm. What do they want? Are they alone? Are they armed? I forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible, keeping my body still. If they didn't know I was awake, maybe they'd leave. The fingers stopped. Silence. The night air felt suffocating. Then, another breath. Right next to my head. I nearly choked on the panic rising in my throat. The person outside was standing inches from where I lay, separated only by a thin layer of fabric. I felt paralyzed. My knife was within reach, but what good would it do me if they were armed? If there was more than one of them? And then, without warning, silence. The breathing stopped. The presence outside my tent vanished. I waited, my whole body rigid, my ears straining to pick up the slightest sound. But there was nothing. Just the usual night sounds, the distant chirp of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the wind shifting through the trees. Was it gone? I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound to return. But it never did. After what must have been an hour, I finally dared to move. My fingers were stiff from gripping the flashlight, my back sore from the tension. My skin was damp with sweat despite the cold. I needed to check outside. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my knife with one hand and unzipped the tent a fraction of an inch with the other. My heart pounded as I shone the flashlight through the small opening, scanning the darkness. Nothing. The forest stood still. No footprints in the dirt. No broken branches. No sign that anyone had been there at all. And that terrified me more than anything. I barely slept. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound made my stomach twist. I kept my knife in my hand, my flashlight within reach. By the time the sky began to lighten, I was already packed. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about taking my time. I just wanted to get out. As I stepped out of my tent, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the dirt just a few feet away, footprints. Not boot prints. Not hiking shoes. Bare feet. A trail of them, leading from the tree line directly to my tent. And then, nothing. No tracks leading away. I turned in circles, scanning the forest. It made no sense. Someone had walked right up to my tent, stood there, breathed, touched the fabric, and then disappeared. A shiver ran through me. I wasn't going to stick around to figure it out. I hiked back to my car as fast as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. By the time I reached the parking area, my legs were aching, my lungs burning. I threw my gear into the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I started the car and pulled onto the road, I glanced into my rearview mirror one last time. And I swear, just for a second, I saw something move between the trees. Camping in the deep woods had always been a way for me to clear my head. No traffic, no phone service, no stress, just me, my gear, and the sounds of the forest. This trip was supposed to be no different. It was late September, the air crisp but not unbearable, and I had found the perfect spot near a small creek, miles away from any designated sites. There were 3 of us, me, my friend Daniel, and his cousin Eric. We had planned a long weekend out in the woods, fishing, hiking, and just unwinding. We drove out on Friday morning, parked at a remote trailhead, and hiked 6 miles in before setting up camp. It was the kind of place where no one just stumbled upon your sight. We had 2 tents, one for me and Daniel, and one for Eric. By the time night fell, we had a good fire going, and were cooking up some of the fish we caught earlier. Everything felt peaceful. The woods stretched out in all directions, dark and endless, but in the glow of the fire, it was easy to forget how alone we really were. As the fire burned down, we turned in for the night. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listening to the faint sounds of the wind in the trees. I was asleep in minutes. I woke up just after 3 a.m., needing to take a piss. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was deathly silent. I unzipped the tent carefully, trying not to wake Daniel, and stepped outside. My boots crunched softly against the dry leaves as I walked a few feet away from camp. That's when I saw it. About 20 yards from our site, near the edge of the tree line, was a sleeping bag. It was fully zipped up. No flashlight, no fire, no sign of movement. Just there. I froze. I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't one of ours. We had our gear, and no one else should have been out here. But there it was, a sleeping bag, lying flat on the ground, positioned as if someone were inside. I swallowed, my throat dry. 1,000 possibilities ran through my mind. Had someone gotten lost and found our campsite? Maybe a hiker who couldn't make it back before dark? But if that were the case, why wouldn't they have approached us? Why wouldn't they have made a fire, or at least spoken up? I took a step closer. My breath felt loud in my ears. "Hello," I whispered. No response. I took another step, then another. The closer I got, the worse the feeling in my gut became. I stopped about 5 feet away. The sleeping bag was old, weathered, covered in dirt. And then I noticed something else. The zipper was closed all the way up. No air hole, no opening, no way for someone to breathe. My stomach twisted. I crouched down, reaching out with trembling fingers. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to know. But I had to. I gripped the zipper and slowly pulled it down. Nothing. The sleeping bag was empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. My hands were shaking. What the hell? I stood up and looked around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trees stood still, branches unmoving. There were no footprints leading up to the bag. No gear. Just this lone, empty sleeping bag sitting in the dirt. I backed away. Something was wrong. I turned and hurried back toward camp. Every shadow felt alive, every sound amplified. When I reached the tents, I ducked inside, zipped it shut, and sat there, heart pounding. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came, and I told Daniel and Eric about what I saw. They laughed at first, but when I took them to the spot, their smiles faded. The sleeping bag was gone. I swore up and down that it was there, that I had seen it, touched it. But there was no sign of it now. No footprints. Daniel asked, frowning. None. We stood there in silence. Maybe an animal dragged it off, Eric suggested. Then where are the drag marks? I asked. No one had an answer. We went about our day, but something felt off. The forest didn't seem as peaceful anymore. The air was heavier. I caught Daniel glancing around every so often, as if he felt it too. That night, we built a bigger fire. None of us wanted to admit we were uneasy, but we stayed up later than usual. Finally, exhaustion won, and we turned in. At some point during the night, I woke up again. But this time, it wasn't because I had to use the bathroom. It was because of footsteps. Soft, slow, moving around the campsite. I held my breath. The steps stopped right outside our tent. I could see the silhouette of feet through the fabric. They weren't wearing shoes. I lay there, frozen, my fingers gripping the handle of my knife. The person, or whatever it was, stood there for a long time. I could hear the faintest sound of breathing. Slow, deliberate. Then, without warning, they moved. I heard the footsteps shuffle away, and then, the unmistakable sound of a zipper. My stomach dropped. I reached over and shook Daniel awake. Someone's out there, I whispered. He sat up groggily. What? Another zipper. My heart was pounding. We grabbed our flashlights and unzipped the tent, bursting out into the night. The fire had nearly burned out, casting weak, flickering light across the campsite. And then we saw it. A sleeping bag, right next to the fire, zipped all the way up. Daniel and I stood there, not moving. Eric, Daniel called out. No answer. We turned toward his tent. The flap was open. His sleeping bag was inside. Empty. Cold fear rushed through me. Eric, I shouted. Nothing. We ran over, shining our lights into the trees. No sign of him. I turned back toward the fire. The sleeping bag was unzipped now, and empty. We searched for hours. No footprints. No signs of a struggle. Eric was gone. At sunrise, we packed up and hiked out, calling for him the entire way. When we got back to civilization, we reported everything. Search and rescue spent days combing the area. They never found him. No clothes. No gear. No body. Just gone. To this day, I don't know what happened to Eric, but I can still hear that zipper in my nightmares. I never used to be the type to get scared easily. Growing up, I spent a lot of time outdoors, hiking, fishing, camping. I knew how to handle myself in the woods, but this trip changed something in me. It made me second-guess every noise in the dark, every rustle of leaves, every shadow on the trail. It made me realize that the most dangerous thing in the wild isn't the terrain, the weather, or even the animals. It's people. This happened a few years ago when I decided to take a solo backpacking trip in a remote section of national forest. I had been feeling restless, stuck in the cycle of work and sleep, and I needed a break. The plan was simple: hike in about 10 miles, set up camp near a small stream I had found on a map, spend a couple of nights enjoying the quiet, then hike back out. I had done similar trips before. I wasn't worried. I packed light but smart: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a water filter, my hunting knife, and a small hatchet for cutting firewood. I also carried bear spray and a pistol. Not because I was scared, but because it was smart to be prepared. The drive to the trailhead took about 4 hours. By the time I parked, it was already early afternoon. I shouldered my pack, double-checked my gear, and locked my truck. There was no one else around, just the wind in the trees and the distant sound of birds. Perfect. The first few miles of the hike were uneventful. The trail was rough but manageable, winding through thick pine forest, then opening into patches of rocky terrain. I made good time. By the 5th mile, I was sweating hard, but I felt good. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird moving through the brush. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. I stopped instantly, heart pounding. The sound stopped too. I turned, scanning the trail behind me. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. I listened, holding my breath, but all I heard was silence. Maybe an echo, or my mind playing tricks on me. I shook it off and kept walking. But a few minutes later, it happened again. Footsteps, light, deliberate, keeping pace with mine. I stopped a second time. Silence. I was being followed. I'm not the paranoid type, but this felt wrong. My first thought was a wild animal, maybe a deer or a bear, moving parallel to me in the brush. But deer don't stop when you stop. And bears don't sneak around like that. I scanned the woods again, looking for movement. The trees were dense, the undergrowth thick. If someone was out there, they were good at staying hidden. I took a slow breath and kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. Every few steps, I listened. Nothing. Just my boots crunching against the dirt and scattered pine needles. I picked up my pace. By mile 7, the sun was getting lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I was making good time, but the uneasy feeling hadn't left me. The thought of setting up camp now, in the open, made my stomach twist. I didn't want to stop, but I had to. I reached the stream around 6 in the evening. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. The area was flat and open, with enough space to set up my tent. Normally, I would have enjoyed the spot: fresh water, a soft patch of earth, and a sky full of stars. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to follow my routine: set up the tent, gather firewood, filter water, eat. The small fire crackled, sending up a thin column of smoke. I tried to relax, telling myself I was imagining things. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not close, but not far. Moving through the trees beyond the firelight. Slow. Careful. I grabbed my pistol, my heart hammering. "Who's there?" I called. My voice was steady, but my hand was tight on the grip. No answer. I waited, listening. The fire popped. The wind shifted the branches above me. Silence. I stood, straining my ears. Nothing. I told myself it was just the forest. The woods are full of sounds: branches falling, animals moving, the wind shifting through the trees. But deep down, I knew better. I forced myself to eat, but my stomach was tight. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept my pistol close, my knife even closer. I told myself I was safe. I had a fire, a weapon. No one was out there. But I didn't sleep. At some point in the night, I must have dozed off. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding, my throat dry. Something was outside my tent, breathing, slow, controlled. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe myself. My fingers wrapped around my knife handle. My pulse pounded in my ears. The breathing was low. Human. I swallowed hard. My pistol was just out of reach. My knife was in my hand, but I was inside a nylon tent. If someone wanted in, I wouldn't have much warning. Then, the breathing stopped, and I heard the softest sound. A zipper. Not mine. I exploded out of the tent, knife in hand, flashlight in the other. The beam swept over the trees, the brush, the fire pit. My breath came in sharp gasps. My hands were shaking. No one was there. The forest was still. The fire had burned down to embers. My gear was untouched. But I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been there, watching me. I packed up at first light. I didn't eat. I barely drank water. I just stuffed my gear into my pack, doused the fire, and started walking. Fast. Every nerve in my body was on edge. The first few miles passed in a blur. I barely looked at the trees, barely noticed the trail. I just moved. Then, at mile 3, I saw them. Footprints. Fresh. Deep. Too fresh to be mine. They had been following me. My mouth went dry. My hands shook. I gripped my pistol tighter and kept moving. Mile 5. No sounds. No footsteps. But I knew they were there. Mile 7. The parking lot was close. Just a little farther. Then I saw it. At the edge of the trees, a figure. Standing just off the trail. Not moving. Just watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I kept walking, faster and faster, until I reached my truck. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I drove away, I saw him in my mirror, standing at the tree line, smiling. I never went back. I've always been the type to camp alone. I like the solitude, the quiet, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world, surrounded only by trees, wind, and the sounds of nature. I know a lot of people don't understand that, but I've never minded being by myself in the woods. This time was no different. I had planned a 3-day solo camping trip deep in the national forest, far from any official campsites. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I picked a spot near a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. It wasn't too far from a creek, which meant I had a water source, and it was isolated enough that I knew I wouldn't run into anyone. Or at least, I thought I wouldn't. I had recently bought a trail camera, the kind used by hunters to capture wildlife footage. It had motion sensors and took pictures whenever something moved in front of it. I figured it would be cool to see what kind of animals wandered around at night while I slept. I strapped it to a tree about 20 feet from my tent, facing the clearing. It was my first time using it, and I was excited to check the footage in the morning. The first day went smoothly. I set up camp, gathered some firewood, and spent the afternoon hiking around the area. It was peaceful, just the way I liked it. As the sun started to dip behind the trees, I made a small fire, cooked some instant noodles, and watched the sky darken. By the time I turned in for the night, everything felt normal. The forest sounds were familiar, crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze, an owl hooting somewhere in the distance. I zipped up my sleeping bag and let the comfort of exhaustion take over. I didn't wake up once during the night. No strange noises, no disturbances. Just uninterrupted sleep. Or so I thought. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed. The air was crisp, the sunlight filtering through the trees. After making some coffee, I decided to check the trail cam. I walked over, unstrapped it from the tree, and flipped through the images. At first, everything was normal. The first few pictures were of me setting up my campsite, then some shots of deer passing through at dusk. I kept scrolling through the images, a small smile on my face. The camera was working exactly as it should. Then I saw it, a photo taken at 3:02 a.m. At first, I couldn't quite understand what I was looking at. The image was dark, but the night vision had captured enough detail to make it clear. It was a picture of me, asleep in my tent. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process it. How could that be possible? The camera had been facing away from my tent, pointed toward the clearing. There was no way it could have taken a picture of me while I was sleeping. My hands felt suddenly cold. I flipped to the next image, a close-up of a man's face. I jerked back as if the image itself could hurt me. The man was grinning, his teeth slightly visible in the grainy night vision glow. His eyes were wide, too wide, and locked directly onto the camera. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting into a tight knot. I flipped to the next picture. Nothing. The rest of the images were normal again, shots of empty forest, a raccoon scurrying past. But those two pictures, those two should not exist. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe the camera had somehow shifted in the night, capturing an angle I hadn't expected. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. The first image was taken from inside my tent. The second was of a man who should not have been there. And I had heard nothing. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Someone had been in my camp, standing right outside my tent, watching me sleep, and I had been completely unaware. I stood there for a long time, staring at the trail cam in my hands. My heart was pounding now, my body suddenly hyper-aware of every sound in the forest around me. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. No sign of anyone. No footprints. No broken branches. But that didn't mean he wasn't still out there. I forced myself to take a deep breath. I needed to think. The smart thing to do would be to pack up and leave immediately. But if someone had been watching me, if someone had taken those photos, they were already ahead of me. They already knew where I was. I had to be careful. I spent the next hour methodically packing up my gear, constantly glancing around, listening for anything out of place. I moved as quietly as I could, making sure nothing got left behind. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a deep, gut-wrenching feeling that I was not alone. Finally, with my backpack secured, I picked up the trail cam and removed the memory card. I wasn't going to leave any evidence behind. I didn't want to risk whoever had been out here knowing I had seen those photos. Then I started walking. The hike back to my car was the longest I had ever taken. The whole way, I listened for footsteps behind me, for the sound of branches snapping, for anything that indicated I wasn't alone. Twice I thought I heard something, a faint rustling in the trees, but when I stopped to look, I saw nothing. The closer I got to my car, the more desperate I became to just get out. When I finally saw it, parked exactly where I had left it, I nearly ran the last 100 feet. I yanked open the door, threw my backpack inside, and locked the doors. For a few minutes, I just sat there, breathing hard, gripping the steering wheel. Then, I started the engine and left. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the forest, safely parked at a gas station on the outskirts of town. Only then did I pull out the trail cam again, scrolling back through the images. I stopped on the man's face, staring at it in the dim light of my car. The longer I looked, the more details I noticed. His skin looked rough, almost dirty. His hair was unkempt, his teeth slightly crooked. But what unsettled me the most was the sheer glee in his expression. Who was he? Had he just been passing through my campsite? Or had he been waiting for me? I knew one thing for certain. I would never camp alone again. Camping has always been my escape. I don't mind the solitude, but this trip wasn't a solo one. I was with 3 friends, deep in a remote part of a national forest. We weren't at an official campground. Instead, we had hiked about 6 miles off-trail, following an old logging road until we found a clearing near a river. It was perfect. No one around for miles, just us, the trees, and the quiet hum of the river in the background. We set up camp in a semicircle. My tent was closest to the tree line, with my friend Marcus's tent beside mine. Then there was Dave's, and finally Sam's, the furthest from the trees. The night was calm, just the occasional gust of wind rustling the leaves. We built a fire, cooked some food, and talked late into the evening. It was one of those nights where everything felt right, until it didn't. Around midnight, I crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and laid back, listening to the others settling in. The fire was dying down, and the forest had that eerie silence that only happens deep in the woods. No cars, no distant hum of civilization, just silence. I was just starting to drift off when I heard a noise. It wasn't an animal. It was the distinct sound of fabric moving. I opened my eyes, heart already beating a little faster. At first, I thought it was just one of the others shifting in their tent. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate dragging sound. It was coming from the direction of the river. I sat up and listened. The dragging stopped. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone left a tarp out, and the wind caught it? But there was no wind. After a few minutes, I laid back down. Probably nothing. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, Marcus was shaking my shoulder. "Dude, get up. Dave's tent is gone." I sat up fast, still groggy. "What?" Marcus had his flashlight out, shining it at the empty spot where Dave's tent had been. "Gone. Not collapsed. Not moved a few feet. Just gone. Sam was standing nearby, rubbing his eyes, looking as confused as I felt. Dave, wearing nothing but his boxers, was standing in the middle of the clearing, staring at the empty patch of ground where his tent had been. "I was asleep," Dave said, his voice shaking slightly. "I heard something weird, like fabric ripping. And then my tent just..." He gestured at the empty space. "It was just gone." That didn't make sense. A tent, even an ultralight one, isn't something that can just vanish. It has stakes, poles. It requires force to move. I grabbed my flashlight and started scanning the area. The only thing left behind was Dave's sleeping bag, crumpled where the tent had been. We checked everywhere. No footprints, no drag marks, no sign of struggle. It was as if someone or something had just picked it up and carried it off. For the next hour, we searched in every direction. It didn't make sense. If a bear had dragged it off, we would have heard it, and there would have been marks in the dirt. If a person had stolen it, how did they do it so fast and so silently? And why just the tent? Finally, about a mile away, near the riverbank, Sam called out, "Over here." We ran toward him, our flashlights bobbing through the trees. And there it was, Dave's tent, sitting neatly among the brush, perfectly intact. Everything was inside. His backpack, his clothes, even his boots. But here's what made my stomach turn. The tent was zipped up from the inside. Dave hesitated before unzipping it. We half expected someone, or something, to be in there. But when he finally pulled the zipper down, it was empty. No footprints around it. No drag marks. Nothing disturbed. It was as if someone had lifted it up, carried it through the trees, and set it down gently in a completely different spot. That was the moment I realized something was seriously wrong. We stood there in silence, the river rushing in the background. No one knew what to say. Finally, Marcus broke the quiet. "We're leaving." Now. No one argued. Packing up was a frantic blur. We threw everything into our packs, barely speaking. None of us wanted to be the last one in the clearing. By the time we started hiking back, the sky was beginning to lighten, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Every crunch of a twig, every rustling leaf, sent my heart pounding. It felt like something was watching us. I don't remember much of the hike back. I just remember the overwhelming sense of relief when we finally saw our car. We never talked about it again. No one wanted to. But the question that haunts me the most isn't how the tent got there. It's who, or what, zipped it up from the inside. I arrived at the lake just before sunset. It was a quiet, hidden spot deep in the national forest, a place I had found on an old map and decided to check out for a weekend of solitude. No marked trails led here, just an overgrown path, barely visible in some places. That was exactly what I wanted: isolation, peace, and the kind of quiet you could only get deep in the woods. The lake was perfect, still and dark, surrounded by dense trees that cast long shadows over the water. No campsites, no signs of human activity. I set up my tent a few feet from the shore, built a small fire, and sat down to eat. The air was cool, the scent of pine thick around me. Every now and then, the water lapped gently at the shore, but aside from that, it was silent. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lake turned black, reflecting the last glow of the sky. I stared into it as I ate, feeling something strange settle in my gut. The water was too still, almost unnatural. I chalked it up to my imagination, finished my food, and crawled into my tent. I woke up sometime in the night, feeling off. Not scared exactly, but alert. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting faint red light over the campsite. The lake was barely visible beyond the trees. Then I heard it, just a small sound, but one that didn't belong. A ripple. It was subtle, like something barely breaking the surface. I listened, waiting for a splash, a rustling branch, something to explain it. Nothing. Just silence. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The night air was cold against my skin as I stepped out, barefoot, onto the damp ground. My light swept across the trees, the fire pit, my gear. Everything was as I left it. Then I pointed it at the lake. The beam of light reflected off the smooth, black surface. No ripples. No movement. I exhaled, telling myself I was just hearing things. Maybe a fish had surfaced and slipped back under. Maybe the breeze had stirred the water. I turned back toward my tent, then stopped. A single ripple spread across the lake. I shone my light back at the water, and that was when I saw them. Too pale, round shapes just above the surface. Eyes. I stopped breathing. The eyes were wide, unblinking, barely visible against the darkness of the water. They were too far out to belong to an animal on shore, but they weren't in a place where someone could be standing. They were in the middle of the lake, just floating there, watching me. My skin prickled. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. My body had locked up, as if any sudden movement would cause those eyes to lunge toward me. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a reflection, an illusion of light. I adjusted my flashlight, angling it in different ways, but the eyes didn't change. They didn't flicker. They didn't shift. They only stared. I backed toward my tent, never taking my eyes off the lake. My hands fumbled for the zipper, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to lose sight of whatever was out there. The second I was inside, I zipped the tent shut and killed the light. Darkness swallowed me whole. My breathing was too loud. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I waited, listening. The lake was silent. No splashing, no movement. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. I wasn't sure. Eventually, exhaustion crept in. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was nothing, that I would wake up in the morning and laugh about it. I forced myself to close my eyes. Morning came slowly. Sunlight filtered through the tent, and for a brief moment, I felt safe again. I unzipped the flap and peered out. The lake was calm, just as it had been when I arrived. No ripples. No eyes. I stepped out, stretching my stiff limbs. The air was crisp, the kind that only came in the deep wilderness. I was ready to forget the night. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the water's edge, directly to my tent. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. The prints were large, human-sized, but something was wrong with them. The toes were too long, almost claw-like, and they were deep, as if whatever made them was heavy. I scanned the shoreline, heart hammering. There were no footprints leading back to the water. Whatever came out of the lake had never gone back in. I didn't waste time. I threw my gear into my bag, not caring about organization. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. As I grabbed my backpack, I glanced at the lake one last time. The surface was still, empty. Then, just as I turned to leave, I saw it. A single ripple. I didn't wait to see what caused it. I sprinted into the trees, never looking back. I hiked faster than I ever had in my life. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the brush made my skin crawl. The feeling of being watched never left me. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach my car, but when I did, I jumped in and locked the doors. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition. As I pulled onto the dirt road leading out of the forest, I couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror. Through the trees, just barely visible, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the lake, watching me leave. I drove faster. I didn't tell anyone. Not really. I mentioned feeling uneasy at the lake when my friends asked how the trip went, but I left out the footprints. The eyes. The figure. I tried convincing myself it was all in my head, but I haven't been able to go camping since. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. Those wide, unblinking eyes floating in the water, watching. Waiting. And the worst part, I still don't know if it ever went back into the lake. I had always preferred the solitude of the wilderness. The deep woods, the crisp air, the quiet. There was something about it that made me feel at peace. That's why I chose to camp alone, far from the designated sites. No noisy campers, no artificial lights, just me and the vast, untamed forest. This particular trip took me to a remote stretch of national forest land, about 20 miles from the nearest town. I had planned a 3-day stay, hiking in with all my gear, setting up camp near a small, slow-moving stream. I had scouted the area weeks in advance using topographical maps, picking a location that was secluded but not dangerously isolated. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I took my time setting up camp, pitching my tent between 2 large pines, building a small fire pit, and organizing my food and supplies. Everything felt routine, normal, but as the sun dipped below the treetops, a strange sense of unease settled over me. It wasn't anything obvious, just a faint discomfort, like I was being watched. I chalked it up to my own mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone, miles from anyone. The only eyes on me belonged to the creatures of the forest. Or so I thought. That night, I sat by the fire, listening to the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional rustle of underbrush. A light breeze whispered through the pines, and the stars above were crisp and clear. It was the kind of night I had come for, perfect solitude. But as I prepared to turn in, I heard something strange. A whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. Faint, almost unintelligible. Words. A voice. I froze, listening intently. The whisper came from beyond the firelight, deeper in the woods. It was too soft to make out, but it was there. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, sweeping the beam across the dense forest. Nothing. No movement, no glint of eyes reflecting back at me. The whispering had stopped. I exhaled, trying to shake the creeping unease. Maybe it had been the wind after all, or my own mind playing tricks on me. I had been alone in the woods before and never felt fear like this. But something about that whisper set me on edge. Still, I convinced myself there was nothing to worry about. I doused the fire, zipped myself into my tent, and tried to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. It took me a moment to realize why. The whispering was back. This time, it was closer. The voice was still faint but clearer now. Words, just below the threshold of understanding. It came from just beyond my tent, soft, steady, like a conversation I couldn't quite make out. I held my breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. Someone was out there. I reached for my flashlight with shaking hands and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I scanned the trees, the underbrush. Nothing. No movement, no figures lurking in the dark. Then the whispering stopped. The sudden silence was even worse. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was my own breathing. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. But the whispering didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning came, bringing the usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. But something felt off. I stepped out of my tent, scanning the area. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The fire pit, the food bag hanging from a high branch to keep bears away, my gear, all untouched. I told myself the whispers had been a dream, a trick of my half-conscious mind. But deep down I knew better. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the unease. I followed the stream for miles, exploring, keeping my mind occupied. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already sinking. As I set up for the evening, I forced myself to stay rational. If there had been someone out there, they would have left some sign, footprints, broken branches, something. The fact that I had found nothing meant there was no one else here, right? That night, the whispers came again. They started earlier this time, just as I was about to drift off. Soft, hushed voices, weaving through the trees. Closer than before. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. This was real. The whispering surrounded my campsite now, moving from one side to the other, as if circling me. I gripped my knife, trying to control my breathing. Then, just outside my tent, I heard one whisper clearly. "He's awake." A cold rush of terror surged through me. I yanked the zipper down, shining my flashlight in every direction. The trees stood silent, unmoving. The whispering had stopped. I scanned the ground. No footprints, no movement, nothing to explain what I had just heard. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my knife in hand, my back pressed against the tent wall. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my gear in record time, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest was too quiet, like it was waiting for something. As I started hiking out, I had the distinct, unsettling feeling that I was being watched. Halfway back to the main trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the bark of a tree, at eye level, were 4 words. "He's awake. We see." The wood looked freshly cut, as if someone had carved it during the night. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just walked faster, gripping my knife until my fingers ached. I reached my car in record time, threw my pack in the trunk, and sped away without looking back. I never went back to that forest. I never camped alone again. And to this day, I still don't know who, or what, was whispering in the woods that night. Camping alone had never scared me before. I'd done it dozens of times, hiking deep into the backcountry, setting up camp miles away from anyone, and enjoying the solitude. The idea of danger had always been more of an afterthought. Sure, I took precautions. I carried a knife, sometimes even a small firearm, but they felt like safety nets rather than necessities. This trip was no different. I had planned a 2-night stay in a remote section of national forest land. No established sites, no marked trails, just a rough idea of where I wanted to go based on some satellite images I'd checked before leaving. The hike-in was peaceful, the landscape stretching wide and empty around me. Towering pines, a winding creek, and nothing but the sound of birds and the crunch of my boots against the forest floor. It wasn't until I met the old man that I started to feel uneasy. I was about 5 miles into my hike when I saw him. He was sitting on a fallen log off the side of the trail, sharpening a small knife with slow, deliberate strokes. His clothes were worn, old cargo pants, a faded jacket, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. Something about him gave me pause, but I nodded in greeting as I passed. "Evening," he said, not looking up. I glanced at the sky. It was still bright, nowhere near evening yet. "Hey," I replied, keeping my pace steady. He didn't say anything else, just kept sharpening his knife. I had gone maybe 10 more steps when he spoke again. "You alone?" I hesitated. Something about the way he asked made me instantly regret stopping. My instinct was to lie, to say I had a group waiting for me ahead. But instead, I just said, "Yeah." The man finally looked up. His face was rough, lined with age and sun exposure. His eyes were dark and unreadable. He studied me for a second, then nodded as if confirming something to himself. "Be careful," he said. "Someone's been following solo campers out here." I stopped walking. The wind shifted through the trees, making the moment feel strangely still. "What do you mean?" I asked. The old man wiped the blade of his knife on his pants. "People been hearin' whistling at night," he said. "Way out here, where there ain't supposed to be no one else." I frowned. "Whistling?" He nodded. "Low. Real slow. Almost like they want you to whistle back." I swallowed. The forest suddenly felt bigger around me, the shadows between the trees darker. "You hear it," the man continued. "You don't answer. You don't move. You don't do nothing to." He held my gaze. "Just wait for it to stop." For the first time on the trip, I felt something other than excitement. A small, gnawing unease settled in my stomach. The old man studied me for another second, then stood up, slipping his knife into a sheath at his belt. "All right then," he said. "You take care now." And with that, he turned and walked into the trees, disappearing as if he had never been there. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to keep going or turn back. I wasn't far from where I planned to set up camp, and I told myself it was just a story, probably some weird local trying to scare hikers. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that his warning wasn't meant to be a joke. I reached my campsite about an hour later. It was a small clearing near the creek, tucked between a few large boulders. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire as the sun dipped behind the trees. As night settled in, I tried to push the conversation with the old man out of my mind. I ate my dinner, listened to the sounds of the forest, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag. I wasn't scared. At least, that's what I told myself. But something about the stillness of the woods felt different that night. I listened harder, noticing the way the usual nighttime sounds seemed distant, muffled. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke up to silence. A deep, unnatural silence that pressed against my ears. Then I heard it. A low, drawn-out whistle. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. It came from somewhere beyond the creek, past the trees. The sound was slow, like someone letting out a breath between their teeth. I froze. The old man's words echoed in my head. "You hear it, you don't answer. You don't move." I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The whistle came again, a little closer this time. Every instinct screamed at me to grab my knife, to sit up, to do something. But I didn't. I just lay there, listening. Minutes passed. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the whistling stopped. I waited, straining my ears for any sound of movement. The forest remained quiet. I don't remember falling asleep again, but when I woke up, the sun was rising. For a long moment, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, trying to convince myself it had been a dream. But when I finally stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints. They circled my campsite, stopping just a few feet from my tent. I hadn't heard a single footstep all night. I should have left. Every logical part of me knew that staying was a bad idea. But pride, or maybe just plain stupidity, kept me from packing up. I convinced myself it had been a coincidence. Maybe some late-night hiker passing through. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. I spent the day hiking further up the ridge, trying to shake the lingering unease. But even in broad daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By the time I got back to my campsite, the sun was already sinking. I rebuilt my fire, cooked my food, and forced myself to relax. It worked, for a while. Then the night stretched on, and I found myself listening again, waiting. The whistle came at midnight. This time, it was even closer. My hands tightened into fists inside my sleeping bag. I wanted to move. I wanted to grab my knife. But I didn't. The whistling lasted longer this time. Slow, almost playful. It moved from one side of my campsite to the other. I didn't breathe. Didn't move. Then the zipper of my tent moved. Not much. Just a slight tug. A slow, testing pull. My entire body locked up. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I must have passed out from exhaustion. When I woke up, the sun was up again. The footprints were back. This time, they led away from my tent. Whoever, or whatever, had been there had walked away on 2 feet. I didn't waste time that morning. I packed my gear in record time and started hiking out. My legs burned from how fast I was moving, but I didn't care. I didn't stop. Not until I was back at my car, back on the road, back where the forest couldn't reach me. I don't know what would have happened if I had answered that whistle, but I never went back to find out.